questions, said it's going to be around that March international break that he will resume, all being well, training with the group. That doesn't necessarily mean he'll be ready to play either off the bench or from the start at that point. So I would think it's April rather than March, all being well for Alexander Isak. And then that Szoboszlai factor, where might he play? Might he even play? The boss was quite coy about that. Could be back at right back, but of course performed so well in midfield. And then spoke about set pieces. Yeah, and more or less, perhaps with more than a nod of respect to the departed Aaron Briggs, was saying that we haven't done a huge amount differently. We've just had better results at both ends of the pitch on set pieces.
Yeah, basically what you're saying, a little bit more luck, isn't it?
Yeah.
At both ends of the pitch. And I do believe that to a certain extent. You know, sometimes we put too much emphasis on certain things, isn't it? And sometimes it is millimetres, isn't it, that decides whether it goes in or it doesn't go in. So I think he's got a point there in terms of, I wouldn't think that Liverpool have gone back to the training ground and spent hours and hours and hours trying to rectify this. But obviously they've looked at it and thought there's things we can do in a different way, and we're now reaping the benefits.
Yeah, let's bring James Pearce back in, who, of course, was at the AXA. We heard him ask a couple of questions. In fact, that set-piece question, I think, came from your good self, James. He's always, I find, at least, I don't know what you think, he always is quite good value as a manager, as perhaps Dutch coaches are. He's quite honest and forthright.
Yeah, he is. Yeah, it's been a kind of a constant throughout his managerial reign here. I think he's kind of happiest and most open when he's talking about, you know, the tactical side of the game and how you prepare for certain matches. You know, probably a little bit less open when, of course, it comes to injuries and contracts and transfers. But yeah, I think that tends to be the way with most managers.
Yes, and I guess it won't be a surprise to you. I don't think it's probably a surprise to most supporters that it's later rather than sooner for the return of Alexander Isak.
Yeah, I think when he suffered that horrendous injury down at Tottenham, the early kind of pointers were the back end of March, and as Arne Slot has just confirmed there, nothing has really changed on that front. I think you could tell that he was loath to kind of be a hostage to fortune in terms of, you know, talking about how in the final stages of recovery, you know, that's where, you know, quite often players can run into issues and pick up little problems that delay things, nailed down to a particular week or whatever. But yeah, late March, early April, he said, back with the squad. Of course, you know, Isak will need some time after so long out to build it up after that. But yeah, you could sense the excitement, I think, in Arne Slot's voice, just the prospect of having him back at the business end of the season. You know, Liverpool, just, you know, between now and then, the mission is to ensure that, you know, that Isak, when he is back, there's something, you know, really tangible still to play for in the FA Cup, the Champions League, and in that pursuit of a top 5 finish in the Premier League. Yeah, and as you said earlier, with no Frimpong this weekend, and Joe Gomez, as always, perhaps wrapped a little bit in some cotton wool, that vexing question of what to do at right back and what that means for the midfielders who'll have to cover that position. Yeah, he wasn't giving too much away, was he, on that front? I think it's a tricky one. I think I could see the sense in playing Joe Gomez in a game like Sunday. You know, he gives you probably a bit more protection in terms of, you know, the aerial threat that Forest do pose. I also, you know, I think last weekend against Brighton was another reminder that when we talk about Dominik Szoboszlai, it's never can he play right back, it's do you really want your most influential midfielder and arguably your most complete footballer playing at right back when you know he's going to have a much bigger influence in the centre of the park. So I wouldn't be surprised if it came down to a toss-up really between Gomez and Curtis Jones. You know, and then it comes down to what does the manager deem the priority? You know, is it Gomez because, you know, he gives you that extra defensive security, or Curtis, of course, gives you a bit more going forward? Yeah, and part of that, Jan, will be about the opposition, won't it? Who's going to take care, for instance, of Morgan Gibbs-White, who, whenever I watch Forest, is more or less, in terms of creativity, the fulcrum. Yeah, and I also think we've seen with Arne Slot, he picks different fullbacks for home games than he would do for away games when our normal first choice fullbacks aren't available, and that will come into his thinking in terms of picking the game or picking the team for Sunday.
Curtis Jones at home against Brighton in the FA Cup is one thing. Playing in a Premier League game away at Nottingham Forest, and because also you know there will be spells where you're going to be under some kind of pressure, which home teams put you under pressure even if they're not having good seasons. So I think that'll be at the forefront. So I would be amazed if it's Curtis Jones as a right back.
Yeah, so which presumably, James, brings us back to Szoboszlai, and I wonder whether whatever the manager decides is the right decision at right back then affects not just the midfield, but maybe even left back. Does he think about, for instance, Andy Robertson instead of Milos Kerkez, not just because he did a good job at Sunderland, because that gives a bit more balance if you're playing an attack-minded midfielder on the other side of the pitch?
Yeah, it's a very different dilemma, isn't it, for him on the left side, because he's almost got an embarrassment of riches. Because I thought Andy Robertson was outstanding in that game at Sunderland, and again, shows the importance of Liverpool keeping hold of him in the January window amid that interest from Tottenham, because letting him go would have undoubtedly weakened the squad. But then, Milos Kerkez comes back in fresh and was arguably produces his best game for the club against Brighton. And so I think he'll probably go with Kerkez just because he is, the number one choice at the minute at left back. And, I think that game against Brighton showcased how far Kerkez has come in a relatively short period of time, because in the early months of the season, I think you could see, the kind of pressure and expectation and scrutiny that comes with a Liverpool player was something he was still having to adjust to, yet now defensively so much more robust, less rash, and, packing a punch going forward, because that was a wonderful assist last weekend for Curtis Jones.
Yeah, and Forest have some talent in those wide areas, which will affect Liverpool's thinking at fullback, as you've said. We've talked just a little bit about Gibbs-White. You're a midfielder. Elliot Anderson. Like him?
Yeah, I do, yeah. I think he's a really good player. I don't necessarily think he's somebody who'll come into a club and transform their fortunes, but he can come in even at the top level and not look out of place because of what he's capable of. Obviously, one of his biggest strengths is his mobility, but he also has a very quick mind. He's not necessarily somebody who produces a lot of assists or a lot of goals, but he's that kind of glue in the middle, isn't he? He's a very important player. He's surprised, but obviously for financial reasons, Newcastle had to sell him. I guess it's a decision they've regretted many times over, but he's having a good season, that's for sure.
Yeah, and these are key individuals, aren't they? Whatever happens to Forest from here forwards, James, and one or two of those star players may or may not be there next season, but they're playing for their own shop window, their own futures, as well as for Marinakis and now Vitor Pereira, aren't they?
Yeah, they are, and you can imagine there's a lot of Premier League clubs, I think, that will be having a look at Anderson and thinking if the worst happened for Nottingham Forest and they were relegated, I think, what are they, 3 points above the drop zone at the minute, he would, they of course would, I think it would be impossible for them to keep hold of someone like that. So yeah, this is the start of a, we talk about it being huge for Liverpool, but it's also just as big for Forest these next few months, because they are in a mess. I mean, it's crazy to think about, Liverpool facing a club on Sunday or on their fourth manager of the season. It's if you were Pereira, you certainly wouldn't have bought a house in the Nottingham area, would you? At the minute, with there's no job security there. He will know that everything hinges on keeping Forest up, and that's why Liverpool really need to impose themselves on this game early on Sunday. Don't give either the home players that belief that they can get something out of it, and certainly don't rile up the crowd, because the City ground can be an imposing place if you give them something to shout about.
Yeah,